stood on the road where the truck had struck and killed the blonde-haired kid. This was about a month ago. I was in the city for business. I had just finished a new project, a shooting of a new film. When I was 12, I watched a movie called Cinema Paradiso, a classic of modern Italian movies. It follows the story of a man who grows up in a small village, and to who the local cinema has a major impact on his life. He goes on to grow up to be a respected film director. There are similarities between our lives. When I had finished my 5th feature film, I had begun to wonder just what kind of influence the films I had watched as a child had on me. Like how they had shaped me into who I was. The character in Cinema Paradiso is bolstered by these. They give him strength and a means of escape. For me, there was one film that terrified me. And that's what brought me back to the street where the big kid had died in the truck accident. It was only coincidence that had brought me here. I had 2 weeks to go until editing would begin on the film, and I needed a break, a way to clear my head. The editing was due to take place in our main studio, but by sheer coincidence, my hotel wasn't too far from where the truck accident had occurred. That evening, I walked to the street. I thought it would maybe look the same. I didn't really know what I hoped to find. I didn't want to drown out my memories. Maybe I just wanted to see them one last time, in order to say goodbye. The video rental store was long since gone. The bakery was still there though. The young man behind the counter told me that he couldn't remember a video rental store being there on the street ever since he had moved to the city some 7 years ago. Time had changed. I had expected to still see the marks of the tires from the truck in the road. I didn't. No black scorch of burned rubber, and no dash of blood in the gutter where the head had landed. The city had changed. It had moved on. Only my memory remained. There was one last place I had to go. My home village in Cornwall had changed perhaps more drastically. I drove there in my white sedan, and when I pulled up into the village's main street, I realized that time had ravaged the place far worse than any hurricane could. I was determined not to let the weight of time dissuade me from what I intended to do though. I parked my car and looked around. I tasted the air. I had drove through the smooth hills, which were once full of wheat, but were now empty. My Kansas was gone. The air tasted different. This, I thought, was my own return to Oz. The post office was shut. It had closed many years before. The corner shop was now a Safeway, and even so, it was a small one with only a single checkout. I went to the local pub, which I had never done when I was a child here. The man behind the bar barely took notice of me. All around me, the people seemed old, as if history had chewed on them and left their wrinkled faces gnawed. I didn't see any children here. The bartender told me that there weren't really any young families around here anymore. No work around here, it seemed. Only the old people who had once worked the farms, waiting for the dust of the earth to reclaim them. Being in the village was painful. I felt like a relic, something that the past had forgotten. Time had moved on. I had moved on. The village had not. It had struggled. It had lost. I didn't want to stay for too long. I knew I wanted to make this quick before being here became too painful, before the ghosts of my memories began to haunt me. I left the pub and started on my walk. The school was the closest, so I went there first. It was a poor decision. The building itself was barren. The sign at the front, with the school's name that had once been boldly etched on it, had been taken down. The building was abandoned. Without children to teach, there was no use of a school anymore. I learned from the man who owned the local pub that the hall, where Chris had choked on a broken piece of eggshell so many years before, was still occasionally used for village meetings, but the classrooms had long since been abandoned. I walked around the building, peering into the rooms. They were all barren, emptied of furniture, no desks, no chairs. One held an old blackboard, its surface covered with dust. When I got to the church, I realized before I even stepped into the yard that the old oak tree was long gone. I found an old priest with a shock of white hair tending the front of the church. When I asked him about the tree, he told me that it had caught a disease several years before and was cut down. I walked into the yard and, sure enough, found a dry, old patch of ground where the tree once stood. The ground felt harder than the soil surrounding it, and rose in a steady lump, like a despoiled grave. The farmhouse had been demolished. It had been concreted over, as if to prevent anyone else from building there. At the foot of the hill, a large, square patch of grey concrete was almost lost amongst the tall grass. I almost stumbled across it, because the years had pushed the details of the location from my mind. When I found the patch of concrete, I half expected to find a small plaque as well, perhaps a dedication to the 4 children who had been murdered and buried here. There wasn't one. The concrete itself, cracked and old by then, with bits of weeds and long grass peeking its way through like nature's own fingertips. It was almost, I thought, like the world wants to forget. I felt tired. The journey had been painful, bittersweet. I felt that I had made my homecoming, and I felt the sadness that it would bring. I wanted to leave, soon. The memories were too strong, ones that were so powerful for me, but that the rest of the world had done its best to forget. I had made my journey, or so I thought, but I wasn't done yet. The sun was starting to set by the time I reached the river. I don't know what brought me there. I had no idea what guided my steps. I'd forgotten the village had a river. In the daylight, I thought, the river might look beautiful, but the sun, starting to dye the sky red and slip down towards the horizon, made the undercurrents of the water look dark. My feet had brought me here, almost unbidden, as if I was following a trail that was laid out for me a long time ago. This is where my broken, ruined yellow brick road leads me, and that's when I remembered. This is where she drowned. I didn't remember it all at once. The images came first. Her face, with her eyes wide in terror, the water splashing over her skin and making it glisten, her mouth full and unable to take in enough air, her short black hair slick against the scalp in utter disarray. The water kept washing over her face, the dark cloak of the current covering her for a few fleeting moments before she broke the surface again, only to dip back into its icy embrace again. I was on the bank of the river. I was clasping onto her arm. But it was cold on a winter's night, and her coat was too wet, and I was wearing gloves, and she was slipping. I couldn't hold on. I couldn't get a grip. I wasn't strong enough. I was only 6 years old, and she was 4. And the river had her. The river held her in its grip, and the water was like fingers, and it had a better grip on her than I ever could. She was crying, shouting for me to help, and the water was weighing her down and stopping her words from escaping. And she was drowning, and I was panicking. I was meant to look after her. She was my sister, and I was her big brother, and I was meant to protect her. I was meant to look after her. and she was drowning. She had fallen in and hit the water with a splash, and that splash was so loud that it had broken the world. And I'd forgotten. Maybe not forgotten. I think my mind had forced out the memory. It knew I couldn't cope with it, not when I was just a little boy. I remember my parents and their tears, and the ambulance that was called, and my parents telling me over and over that it wasn't my fault. But it was. I was still that little boy who had made himself forget that he was standing on the riverbank, clutching onto the girl's arms as she was drowning. This, I realized, was why I had came here. I needed to make myself remember. I had to find the source of my fear, remember what it was that had kept this moment from my mind. She drowned. In the river, she drowned. I hadn't remembered it. I'd made myself forget. And that memory had seeped out into the movie. That, I realized, was my secret. I'd kept it locked up inside me, but the memory had found a way out. My little sister's ghost wouldn't be forgotten. Each time I thought of that damnable movie, each time I tried to remember Return to Oz, I remembered Dorothy Gale drowning in the river. But it wasn't Dorothy. It had never been Dorothy. It had been my sister. And she was my ghost, not some sinister, skulking figure that thirsted for revenge. But she had been there, always, in my shadows, haunting me until I made my own journey into the past, made my own Return to Oz. That film was important to me. I knew it now. I'd never be free from it, even when I tried to say goodbye. When I spoke my lost sister's name on that riverbank, I knew that she would follow me forever. I couldn't leave her behind. I couldn't lock her away again. Return to Oz bound us together forever. Because my mother, who had loved Judy Garland, had named my sister Dorothy.